A Treatise of Satan's Temptations. Part 2. By Richard Gilpin. A Discourse of the Malice, Power, Cruelty and Diligence of Satan. Fourth part of Chapter 1. That it is Satan's grand design to corrupt the minds of men with error, the evidences that it is so, and the reasons of his endeavors that way. 5. Fifthly, the greatest and most successful stratagem for the hindering a reformation, is that of raising up an army of errors. Reformation of abuses, and corruptions in worship or doctrine, we may well suppose the devil will withstand with his utmost might and policy, because it endeavors to pull that down which cost him so much labor, and time to set up, and so crosseth his end. They who are called out by God to jeopardize their lives in the high places of the field, Judges 5:18, undertake a hard task in endeavoring to check the power of the mighty, whose interest it is to maintain those defilements, which their policy hath introduced, to fix them in the possession of that grandeur and command which so highly gratifies their humors, and self-seeking aspiring minds. But Satan, knowing the strength of that power which hath raised them up to oppose, with spiritual resolution, the current of prevailing iniquity, usually provides himself with this reserve, and comes upon their backs with a party of deluded, erroneous men, raised up from among themselves, and by this means he hopes either to discourage the undertakers for reformation, by the difficulty of their work, which must needs drive on heavily when they that should assist, prove hinderers, or at least to straiten and limit the success. For by this means, 1. He divides the party, and so weakens their hands. 2. He strengthens their enemies, who not only gather heart from these divisions, seeing them so fair a prognostic of their ruin, but also improve them, by retorting them as an argument, that they are all out of the way of truth. 3. The erroneous party in the rear of the reformers, do more gall them with their arrows, even bitter words of cursed reviling, and more hazard them, with their swords and spears of opposition, than their adversaries in the front, against whom they went forth. In the meanwhile, they that stand up for truth, are as corn betwixt two millstones, oppressed with a double conflict, beset before and behind. This hath been Satan's method in all ages. And indeed, policy itself could not contrive anything, that would more certainly obstruct reformation than this. When the apostles, who in these last days were first sent forth, were employed to reform the world, to throw down the ceremonies of the Old Testament, and heathen worship, Satan had presently raised up men of corrupt minds, to hinder their progress. What work these made for Paul at Corinth, and with the Galatians, the epistles to those churches do testify. The business of these men was to draw disciples after them, from the simplicity of the gospel, nay, to another gospel. And this they could not do but by setting up themselves, boasting of the Spirit, carrying themselves as the apostles of Christ, and contemning those that were really so, insinuating thereby into the affections of the seduced, as if they zealously affected them, and that Paul was but weak and contemptible, nay, their very enemy, for telling them the truth. Galatians 4:16. What unspeakable hindrance must this be to Paul? What grief of heart, what fear and jealousy must this produce? He prophesieth he was afraid lest he had bestowed upon them labor in vain, Galatians 4:11. And that he did no less than travail of them in birth the second time, verse 19. If one Alexander could do Paul so much evil, by withstanding his words, that he complains of him, and cautions Timothy against him, 2 Timothy 4:24. If one Diotrephes, by prating against John with malicious words, prevailed with the church, that they received him not, nor the brethren, 3 John 10, what hurt might a multitude of such be able to do? In the primitive times of the church, after the apostles' days, when those worthies were to contest with the heathen world, the serpent cast out of his mouth water, as a flood, after the woman, which most interpret to be a deluge of heresies, and some particularly understand it of the Arian heresy, that he might hinder the progress of the gospel. Which design of his did so take, that many complaints there were of hindering the conversion of the heathens, by the errors that were among Christians. Epiphanius tells us that pagans refused to come near the Christians, and would not so much as hear them speak, being affrighted by the wicked practices, and ways of the Priscillianists. Austin complains to the same purpose, that loose and lascivious heretics administered, matter of blaspheming to the idolatrous heathens. In after times, when religion grew so corrupt by popery, that God extraordinarily raised up Luther, Calvin, and others in the 15th and 16th centuries, to discover those abominations, and to bring back his people from Babylon, the devil gave them no small trouble, by a growth of errors, so that they were forced to fight against the papists before, and those Philistines behind. Insomuch that Reformation attained, not that height and universality, which might rationally have been expected from such blessed undertakings. This was the conjecture of many, particularly of our countryman Dr. Prideaux, that if these fanatic enthusiasts, which with so great a scandal to the gospel then break forth, had not retarded and hindered those glorious proceedings, that apocalyptical beast of Rome had been not only weakened and wounded, but utterly overthrown and slain. In particular cities, where any of the faithful servants of Christ endeavored to detect the errors of popery, these instruments of Satan, were ready to join with the common adversary in reproaches and disturbances. How they opposed Musculus at Augusta, and with what fierceness they called him viper, false prophet, wolf in sheep's clothing, you may see in those that write his life. How these men hindered the gospel at Limburg against Junius, at Zurich against Zuinglius, at Augsburg against Urbanus Regis, you may also see in their lives. In all which, and others of like nature, you will still find, 1. That there was never a reformation begun, but there were erroneous persons to hinder and distract the reformers. 2. That these men expressed as great hatred against the reformers, and oftentimes more, than against the papists, and were as spitefully bitter in lies, slanders, and scorns against them, as the papists themselves. 6. Sixthly, Satan can also make use of error either to fix men in their present mistaken ways and careless course, or as a temptation to atheism. Varieties of opinions and doctrines do amuse and amaze men. While one cries, "Lo, here is Christ," and another, "Lo, he is here," men are so confounded that they do not know what to choose. It is one of the greatest difficulties to single out truth from a crowd of specious, confident pretenses, especially seeing truth is modest, and oftentimes outnoised by clamorous, bold error, yea, sometimes outvied by the pretensions of spirit and revelation in an anti-scriptural falsehood. At what a loss is an unskillful traveler where so many waves meet! While one party cries up this, another that, mutually charging one another with error, they whose hearts are anything loosened from a sense and reverence of religion, are easily tempted to disbelieve all. Thus error leads to atheism, and lays the foundation for all those slanderous exceptions against Scripture by which godless men usually justify themselves in their religion. Now though all wicked men are not brought to this, because the consciences of some do so strongly retain the sentiments of a deity, that all Satan's art cannot obliterate those characters. Yet the consideration of the multitude of errors, doth rivet them in the persuasion of the truth and goodness of that way of religion, wherein they had been educated. Thanks.